Everyone? Okay, so now if somebody from one person from each of your groups can share out what you discussed in terms of your how to amplify mental health in the community and also the Filipino American experience. Doesn't have to be too long because we do want to hear a lot of ideas here. So if we could start with this group and
Good morning.
Hello. Good morning. I think what our group really emphasized a lot on was about, for us being the first generation of migrant Filipino parents and the children coming in here, was particularly open up the conversation. And that conversation entailed about the disparity of our experiences that shaped misunderstandings, and then also the differences of intention. So a good example, to not take away from everybody else, but a good example that we really honed in on was going away to college and feeling like parents weren't particularly like as communicative or not as felt like supportive, while as our white friends or others would be like, oh, guess who called me today? And guess what? I got a care box. But then for us, it's like, oh yeah, they just said hello this morning. Or like as my mom would be like, oh, better. She would be like talking about money. You know what I mean? Like, are you okay? I'm working hard for you. But the intention, what we were saying with that is that there's such an underlying support and that love and that connectedness that we had. But through that vision that they had initially for us, is that we had to fight through. So just like EJ had mentioned, that resiliency that we too, just not even really realizing it, but subconsciously had to fight through that. So that's what we did. And then as for me, is that I got educated because I was so inquisitive about idiosyncrasy and just the nuances that I was like, I love it. I just don't get it. Why do I feel lost in such a big world? And so with Filipinos is really understanding that there are 1,000 islands, there are 1,000 different dialects. And with that is that we have an identity crisis. Like we clearly are trying to figure out and really try to mesh well with such a big world, but yet very small and trying to fit in. And so when we come in from such that culture and into the Americanized world, is that resiliency again, is that navigating through, finding courage, and understanding that our way has a different way. And so with communication comes with the love and the faith and just to keep going. So that's what we're doing.
thank you. So sharing out those stories, especially as first gen.
Yeah.
Next, would you like to go? Let's go.
Use the mic. Yeah, turn on the mic.
Hello, that's loud. Angelo Dalmacio with NASA. We had discussions along the same lines. I think where a lot of us are going to have the same sort of baseline idea that communication is the way to sort of to begin to amplify and normalize mental health care in our community. We talked about it on two levels. Opening lines of communication on a very ground level with the people in your family, right? Having conversations that remove the stigma of seeking mental health as a weakness, and maybe reframing it as a strength, as something that you're doing to protect yourself and the people you love. And we also talked about simultaneously having a national conversation in the form of maybe like a PSA or like TFC or ABSC, where while we're having this conversation with each other, we're also hearing national amplifying of the same message that mental health is something that's important, it's not weak, and it's something that will elevate the community. And that's what we're doing.
Next group.
Hello. Cheryl Pomo-Arcano with CCFSO and a student at Morgan State University. I think what we talked about in our group was that how we kind of amplify mental health within our respective field is just educating on the topic about mental health, and also we talked about how like there's these stigmas within our community of like saving face and only knowing what you know. So like for me personally, growing up, my parents never really liked to talk about things. So, and then when I grew up, I don't like to talk about things, but we have to come to recognize, like that's one of our characteristics, and then moving that mindset of like, okay, recognizing there's an issue and being uncomfortable and talking about it. And then we also talked about, I guess, just having resources for the community, because that's like one of the issues, like having that access.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And is there two more groups or?
More groups.
Next group.
Hi. My name is Christian. I'm a student at the University of Michigan, but also affiliated with the National Federation of Filipino American Associations, or NAFA. So our group talked about sort of the student perspective in terms of what organizations on college campuses are doing. So Filipino Americans, like student groups, but also just like people of color at large. We found that at the interpersonal level, social support is a very pertinent and very salient aspect to treating mental health and having that conversation. Oftentimes there was also a lot of conversation about the stigma of mental health, but also sort of what the resources are in college campuses, where we talked about our experiences that mental health services are really culturally competent. They don't really hone in on what the aspects are for people of color or Filipino Americans are. And so people feel is more isolated, more stigmatized, they have nowhere to turn to. But I think the role of the student organization is that they have that sense of community or that tough love. But also with the Filipino American experience, I think Filipino organizations are really having the job to have more accessible ways for students to learn about their culture and identity and have that dialogue in ways that they might have not been before. We also talked about conversations at the national level with SAMHSA, where cultural competency and giving voice to people who are at the margins are really important. And also things like example in the military, where there's a big stigma of not talking about mental health. So again, like including, I think, interpersonal communication with social support with like family, friends, and among students and peers is really important and something that we talk about.
And the last group.
Hi, I'm Christine Catibon. I am here representing the Division on Filipino Americans for the Asian American Psychological Association. We have one. There is an organization of academics, researchers, and clinicians that EJ and Kevin founded a few years ago, and so I'm happy to be here. Our group also talked a lot about young adults, because a lot of us work with young adults or in universities. In my capacity as a clinician, I was kind of sharing about the ways that I constantly try to outreach to the Filipino student organization, and yet they don't really take up on that because they don't want to discuss it as a group, but individually they will flood counseling and psychological services. So I think there's something to be said with really decreasing the stigma, as we talked about, but also trying to find more marketable or compatible ways for them to have conversations before it even gets to that, because many times they just hold it in until their symptoms are pretty extreme. And so how can we start having open conversations to make it okay to talk about I'm not feeling great and the stigma of that. We also talked about the influence of our families on that, because our children are reflective of their parents, and so a lot of the shame and stigma come from like, oh, something's wrong with you, you're seeking therapy, and somehow that's going to look bad on them. And so how do we also open up that conversation for older people? Because I think younger people, younger Filipinos are starting to utilize their services much more in the counseling centers, but then how does that reflect on the way that they're able to communicate that to their family? And my family still has no idea what I am, I'm just a doctor, but psychology is what, I don't know what that is, So it's, so I think it's, let me see if I covered everything. Yeah, so, and especially when a lot of symptoms start coming up in young adulthood, like prodromal symptoms for schizophrenia or bipolar breaks, a lot of them seeing a lot of suicidal ideation and attempts. We need to figure out a way for them to make it okay to talk about it before it gets to that place and get them support.
And as I mentioned, this is being live streamed, and we have a few people on the webinar that are also discussing and providing their ideas. So hello to the West Coast. They wanted me to share a couple of their programs that they do to amplify the Filipino-American experience. So Dr. Rosa Castro is funded by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to do the Filipino Family Health Initiative in UCLA. So that is a family parenting program that helps to promote intercultural communication, intergenerational dialogue amongst families. Another person on the webinar, we have there are two Filipino family mental health initiatives, one based in San Mateo County and one in San Francisco, and so they do have resources that promote mental health. They do anti-stigma reduction courses, and so for those that haven't heard of those or would like to start those sorts of programs in their communities, we can definitely connect you with them. And then lastly, wanted to end with Captain Fields as they talk a little bit more about HMI.
I didn't know, I forgot we were live streaming. Hi, California. Hi, Lisa, I'm doing good. Be proud of me, I'm more. Anyway, I just want to close it that Captain Jover and I, as like we said, one of our prevention efforts is the HMI, Healthy Mind Initiative. And with that said, we want to be able to bring this to the community. There are other Filipinos who are officers also, but they just couldn't be with us today. So there are at least about 10 of us that we would like to, start educating the community about, about mental health. So we're available. So if you have a big crowd or something, it's a 90-minute presentation with just a little bit of discussion. And I think that's a good way of starting the conversation if we come to you. So sometimes they're not going to come to us, right? So our goal is for us to go to the community and start, educating everyone.
Take advantage of us because we are made out of, just like you guys, professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, physicians, social workers, and really we would like to partner. Whether that's a church, whether that's the place where you work, or place where you live, we are there. It's time to come out of the community and be engaged. So thank you.
Yeah.
So next up, we have our second discussant. We're going to be talking about focusing on early identification, diagnosis, and intervention of mental health disorders or mental health conditions, what they're also called. So we have Dr. Ramon Rivera, who's a physician and psychiatrist, and he's also the president-elect of the Association of Filipino Physicians in America.
Hello. Magandang umaga po sa inyo lahat. Good morning. You wait for the slides. So my topic actually is anong pakiramdam niyo? Anong pakiramdam mo? In English is how do you feel? So how do you feel today? Guys, how do you feel today? Need to be more upbeat, right? This is Filipino-American mental health and education for all of us. So it's also a common question that I ask my patients. I'm a psychiatrist, a physician. I treat patients that come to my clinic. Mental health is very near and dear to me. I work 7 days, oh, no, not 7 days, 5 days a week in a hospital. So I treat mentally ill, hospitalized patients. At the same time, I have an outpatient clinic in Philadelphia where I treat patients on an outpatient basis. So I have that experience of inpatient as well as outpatient. So basically, the talk is about our early identification, diagnosis, and intervention of mental illness. So the hope is that early on, we can ask questions to our, kababayans, our family members, and ask, how do you feel? Ano pong pakiramdam nyo? So that they can be brought into a physician, a doctor, and ask other questions. Do you have problems with sleep or appetite? In the hope to get a diagnosis and treatment. So just to put things in perspective, next slide. You just heard the different levels of prevention. The first topic is basically on primary prevention. That is catching, giving patients or people to prevent them to getting an illness. For example, the most common form of primary prevention is what? Immunization, like flu vaccines, right? To prevent the flu. My talk primarily will be on secondary prevention, identifying early signs and symptoms of mental illness, and preventing further progress of that illness. So secondary prevention and tertiary prevention. Next slide. So I borrowed this slide from the National Institute of Mental Health. There are 50 million Americans suffering from mental illness currently, maybe more now because this slide's a little old. Most of them are not severe and go untreated. Maybe helpful to understand the science, the biology of mental illness. So I'm coming from a different perspective, thinking more of mental illness as a brain disorder. So just another slide from the National Institute of Mental Health. 1 in 4 adults, it's a very big number. 1 in 4 adults are with mental illness currently in the United States. And a staggering 57.5 billion being spent for treatment. 36% of those with mental disorder are receiving treatment. So 64 don't go untreated. As you can see here, the most common mental disorders most commonly is anxiety disorders, 18.1. And this includes panic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, OCD, you've heard of OCD, and generalized anxiety disorder. The mood disorders, 9.5%. Depression is 6.7%. The schizophrenia, 1%. Next slide. So now, talking about the Filipino American community, we have high prevalence in alcohol, substance abuse disorders. We have high prevalence in depression compared to the general population. We have high rates of suicide, even double compared to the US population. We have lower rates of seeking mental health services compared to other Asian American groups. 75% of Filipino Americans never use any type of health service. Next slide. So this slide is borrowed from Thomas Insel. Dr. Insel was formerly the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. you can see here the mortality from medical causes. You can see leukemia. There is very much improvement in the mortality of leukemia, as well as heart disease, AIDS, stroke. But look at suicide. No change, right? That's why we need this conference and others to improve that rate there. Suicide rates have not changed. The change in improvement of mortality from other medical causes, stroke, AIDS, heart disease, and leukemia, is all due to research, biomedical research. So why don't we do that also with mental health? Look at this data here. 44,000 deaths per year of suicide. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. The third most common cause of death in ages 15 to 25. And 90% of suicides are related to mental illness, major depression, schizophrenia, etc. Next slide. And let's also talk about the morbidity related to mental illness. It's the highest compared to the other medical disorders. And again, that's due to psychiatric disorders. Next one. So mental disorders are very common. So why is that staggering high in mortality and high in morbidity? Because it's very common. Mental disorders are common. 1 in 4, actually, this is old. 1 in 4, like those I saw this slide, disabling. And the other thing too is early onset. It starts early on in life. Next. So half of all lifetime causes of mental illness start at age 14. Are you guys surprised by that number? No. 75% start at age 24, and 79% do not access care. So, next slide. May I propose to you then that because of improvements in biomedical research and the improvements in mortality of the other illnesses and suicide did not improve, why don't we call mental illness as brain disorders? Not mental disorders, behavioral disorders, but brain disorders. Disorders of the brain. Because the mind, emotions, etc., what you're listening right now, what's going on right now is the brain is the one that's working. So mental illness is a brain disorder. That's what I want to emphasize today. Your take-home message today is that it is a brain disorder. What happens in the brain, next slide, is problems with the circuits in the brain. It's a neurochemical imbalance in the brain that causes mental illness. Next one. Oh, actually it's the other one. This is what this slide. So the most important illness that basically exemplifies brain schizophrenia. Brain is a brain disorder. But mental illness is a brain disorder. Is schizophrenia. These are slides. These are scans of brains of schizophrenic patients. You can see that in early schizophrenia, you can see areas in red already defective in the brain. And 5 years later, you can see bigger areas of red in the superior temporal gyrus and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. These areas of the brain are affected in schizophrenia. You can see evidence that indeed it is a brain disorder. Next one. Oh, the other one. Sorry about this. So, as I said a while ago, mental illness or brain disorders are psychic problems with neurochemistry in the brain, like chemicals like dopamine, acetylcholine, serotonin, GABA, norepinephrine, and adrenaline, epinephrine are all detected in different kinds of brain disorders or mental illness. Next slide. Why does this matter? For brain disorders, behavior is plastic to a change, meaning that if you have symptoms, it's already too late. There are new tools now that are present for brain changes long before symptoms emerge. We can now decipher through PET scans and others of the early occurrence of symptoms. Early detection and early intervention will give us the best outcomes. So for now, those CAT scans and PET scans are not readily available. What we have is the Bible of psychiatry, which is the DSM-5. It is where you ask questions. That's how you diagnose mental illness. Your problems in sleep, appetite, etc., etc. Next one. And I am a physician, so I treat mental illness with medications, antidepressants, antipsychotic medications, anxiolytics. We now have ECT also, transcranial magnetic stimulation, vagus nerve stimulation, and deep brain stimulation as other treatment options for different mental disorders or brain disorders. And lastly, psychotherapy, talk therapy. It's important for us to talk if we're mentally ill, to talk with our psychologists and other therapists. Yes, stop. and that's the end of the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rivera. Now we're going to do the same thing.
We're going to step into the void and
Adjusting.
adjust, adapt, and instead of doing group discussions, we'd like to just start an open discussion around this topic. So Dr. Rivera talked about the medical basis of diagnosing various mental health disorders. And I know many people in this room are not clinicians, and so I'd like to turn this conversation on its head and ask you all, in addition to what's currently known about mental health disorders, what are the gaps in helping us increase our access to services? What are things that you would like to know about the medical field that could potentially help you to help others seek services? Try to be creative in your thinking around this topic, because I do know that this may be the more clinical topic during today's workshop, during today's forum. So, does anybody have any responses or reactions to the
As a clinician, I'm wondering though, is it possible, and I don't know how this would really work out, but because we see doctors, at some point, would there be other ways where we can actually primarily have, let's say, a brain scan or something like that, to have that early intervention detection? Because oftentimes we go to the doctor, and say, let me check your blood pressure, let's check this, let's do that. And so what if it's something where we can actually revise a little bit of that and add that piece into that, particularly because if he said, if I heard him correctly, is that it's going to be too late once we recognize there is some sort of symptom. So if there is that early detection within that primary care first visit, essentially that would be what we call early intervention, correct?
Yes, actually, that is on the works. We don't have PET scans and fMRIs or MRIs or CAT scans that are available at this point, but they are in the works to basically identify early brain disorders, early parts of the brain that maybe are defective, so that you can intervene early and maybe start your psychotherapy, maybe talk with the therapist first before you start medications. But even when they are diagnosed, they're fully diagnosed with a major depressive disorder or a panic disorder, early medication, especially in schizophrenia, our early intervention using medications is topmost priority to prevent the chronicity of mental illness. So at this point, as I said a while ago, we don't have those PET scans and scans available. They're in the works. They're being researched right now. We have the DSM as the tool to diagnose patients. Asking questions, basically. That's why my topic is, anong pakiramdam mo? You ask questions to your relatives, friends, to your community members. Is there something wrong with you or something like that? I think that would trigger conversation, maybe bring this person to a doctor for an evaluation. And the other thing too that I did not emphasize a while ago is that equating mental illness as a brain disorder erases the stigma, maybe eliminates the stigma of mental illness, because you're going to a doctor for an evaluation and treatment.
So, quick question.
Sure.
So I know that when you go to a primary care doctor, for example, because this is how I got treatment, I expressed that I was, feeling depressed and anxious, and because I use those words, because I know what those words can equate to major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, I was given a screening form, the PHQ-9 for depression and then the GAD-7 for anxiety. So how do we encourage people to talk about that, let's say when they go to their primary care physician in the Filipino community? Because I know that not everyone is going to be expressing it, I don't know, openly, or they might not use the words depressed, maybe they say like their heart hurts or something like that. So how do we change that conversation?
So would we dialogue with you to start that question, like, so how are you really feeling to dig deep?
Yeah, so basically the first question is, how do you feel today? Anong pakiramdam mo ngayon? And that may start the conversation. May say, oh, masamang pakiramdam ko, may problema ko sa sleep, hindi ako nakakain. So, you ask those questions triggered towards a diagnosis. Concentration, energy level, have you lost interest in a lot of things? So those questions are in the DSM. But there are also other tools that you could use, like, as you said, the screening tools for depression. There's Beck depression scale. There are other things, MADRS and things like that. But maybe that would be, those questionnaires are now available in your primary care physician's office. We're now trying to incorporate psychiatry with other specialty groups, especially family medicine, so that psychiatry will be less seen as a mental illness, but more of a biological illness.
So I want people to also share, not just ask them questions, all right? Because I know that there are experts here who also are knowledgeable about this, so it is really your turn. So, yes. Oh, you have something to share?
But I do know, because I worked at a private practice especially, and I served as a doctor and physician, so I did ask those questions, but to be quite honest, they were very rushed, and since they were working with kids, even people my age or like around the 20s, most of them didn't really know the language to kind of express. And I know it's culturally as well, is that even if we know we're feeling bad, we don't know how to talk about it, one. And two, even if we know we're feeling bad, we kind of use resiliency and strength as a crutch almost to kind of push past it because we need to be okay the next day even if it's not. So basically for early intervention, especially with children, it's really, really important because they don't really know any better when it comes to language, how to implement kind of teaching them what certain things are, what certain things mean, and if things get bad enough, where is that person can really be able to talk about how they're feeling, not only with doctors, but with like parents or even with us as well. So that was a question, sorry.
All right. Well, on that question, because I know that there are some people here who are knowledgeable about this whole issue, who can share, all right?
So I do want to share that there's a tool that's been really helpful and a lot of communities can use it. I don't know if anybody's heard of National Depression Screening Day. It happens in October. We just had ours, but it's a way for us to get students into our college counseling centers because it lists the symptoms. So it will do the DSM-5 symptoms, but it'll say like, how have you been sleeping? Or are are you having suicidal thoughts? Are you feeling guilty? Are you feeling shameful? And so with the self-report, we don't say that it's a diagnosis, but we say if you have a certain score, there might be a likelihood, and then maybe it would be helpful to follow up with a clinician. And so we've done this in community counseling centers, we've done this in student counseling centers, and I think there's less stigma because we're not calling it a diagnosis, but at least they understand terms like guilt and sleep and trauma and stress and worry and all of those things. So it's actually pretty close to the DSM criteria, but it's presented in such a way, we call it test your mood. We don't call it National Depression Screening Day. And then we give them incentives like free mood passes or something like that. But I think that's been a really effective tool to get the word out to the community.
All right, I'm gonna ask Lauren. Lauren, where are you, Lauren? To share something because I know that she has something very useful, insightful, thoughtful to share. Lauren, thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren, and I'm with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And I just wanted to, first of all, thank you all for having me here, and thanks to everybody who's going to be participating in the walk later this afternoon. I just wanted to share a little bit about what we call AFSP, kind of the services that we have to offer. And so one of the main things that we focus on right here in the community is our education programs. So we offer 3 main education programs here in the DC area. We do something called Talk Saves Lives, which is geared towards the general community. And we'll go into different businesses, we'll host educations at libraries, we'll go to different church groups, things like that. And we present Talk Saves Lives, so it's just a general overview of how to speak about suicide, the proper language to use, how to approach somebody that you might be worried about. And then we also have programs that are similar to that. We have one that's called More Than Sad, that's geared toward high school students. So we'll go into high schools and give those presentations. And then we also have a college program called It's Real, that's geared more towards college-age students. So we'll go into local colleges and give that presentation. We also have our Loss and Healing program. And within our Loss and Healing program, we offer the Survivor Outreach Program, which we call SOP. And that is, we have folks in the community who are suicide loss survivors. So they've lost somebody to suicide, and they're at least 2 years out of that loss. And they go through training. And then if you are somebody who has lost someone to suicide, 2 days ago or 10 years ago, we'll match you with somebody who's lost, who has a similar loss. So if you've lost a parent or a child or a friend, we'll match you with somebody in the community that you can speak to. They're not a clinician, but just somebody who's been through the same experience, someone that might be able to offer you support in another way as somebody who has experienced a similar loss than you have. We also have our International Suicide Loss Survivor Day, which we have in 4 locations here, which is coming up on November 17th. And not only do we do that here, but it's all over the country on that same day. And we have lots of other different programs as well. And I have some educational materials in the other room that I'll leave here. And if anybody's interested in picking those up and reading more about what we do, there's also a business card of our education chair. And so if anybody's interested or has a group that they would like us to come to share our education, whether it be college, high school, or just your workplace or a group that you're involved in, we'd be happy to offer those trainings. And they are free to the community, so there's no charge for any of those programs. And then of course we do our big walks. Like today we have the walk in DC, which will have over 1,500 participants, which is really exciting. And AFSP is the #1 privately funded organization for suicide prevention research. So all the money that we raise in this community, some of it stays here to offer those programs to you all and your different groups, and then the rest goes to research. And our goal is to reduce the suicide rate 20% by 2025. So with the research that we're doing, that's what we're working towards. So I'll leave those materials in there for you, and you can feel free to take whatever you would like. And there's contact information as well if you have any questions. And I'm headed to the walk, so if you're there, please come and say hello. And thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to refocus the discussion, because we only have one time for one comment. We really want you to share your experience, what needs to be done, or what you have done to improve early detection of mental disorders. That's really the question. So if anybody has something to share on this question, Rita, you have something to share? All right.
Thank you so much. My name is Rita Hermanakis. Sorry about my voice. Demographically speaking, the Filipino American community is something like about 4 million now. 2010, we were about 3.4 million. Now, according to the Census Bureau, is that demographically speaking, is that over 1 out of 5, or 22% of the Filipino population in the United States are 65 years old and older. 65 years old and older. That's more than 1 out of 5, 22%. Now, mental illness is sort of a big, big cloud up there. But if I may sort of compartmentalize it, to use the word intersectional, Dr. Katipon had mentioned the aging, a part of our community. The elderly who presumably are coming from the Philippines already as adults, so that they are more compared to the total population in America, they have a greater percentage of it. Now, so that their orientation is more Philippine than American culture. Now, I have heard as a journalist, and from my own personal observation, many elderly among my friends and relatives who are in America, who are in the senior level, they say they are lonely. Now, Dr. Rivera, you said, what are you feeling? Anong pakiramdam mo? Have we talked to our elders about how they are feeling? Why they are so punished by the feeling, the painful, emotional feeling of being lonely? Because their children, they're in school, or they're hanap buhay and all that, and they are alone. I would like to sort of kind of bring that to the attention of when we're talking about mental illness. And this is probably one of those sections, if I may use Dr. What's his name now? The first speaker. Intersectional. Dr. David, you did mention intersectional, and if I understood it correctly, is that one section of the Filipino and Filipino-American population in the United States is elderly more than 1 out of 5. And I just would like to bring this to the attention when we're talking about mental health,
Okay.
all its ramifications. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. I'm sure this will be an issue that we'll be discussing throughout the afternoon. Yes, please.
I think just to respond to Rita's comments, she wasn't here today, but Nicole Cadodius is the director of practice improvement at the National Council for Behavioral Health. She has an expertise in older adults, is a Filipino American, and is willing to have a webinar or some sort of discussion around this specific topic. Intersection between older adults, mental health, help seeking, caregiving, various sorts of topics in the future. In terms of, I think, my own response to this topic, I would say that when it comes to receiving, seeking services, I hear and have personally felt barriers around getting the right treatment in terms of finding someone that is understanding of my experiences as a Filipino American and second-generation immigrant, our family, coming from a family of immigrants, and I just want to put that out there. Two, I've also heard that because we're Asian American, we are given a lower dosage to start off for medication. And have found that for myself and others, it's taken about 3, 4, 5 changes in dosage in order for that medication to actually feel like it's working. And so when we say that we're Asian American, we are not a monolithic group. We have different Asian American, well, I mean, Filipinos in general have been colonized by many people. And so can say that we are more similar to the Latin American community, maybe their dosage, I'm not really sure. But to just keep that into consideration as well for the clinicians and those that do work in prescribing medication. I think that's something that we should consider.
All right, let me have Dr. Romero respond, and then maybe we'll just have one more comment, comment.
So just to address the issue of cultural sensitivity, I think in our, in all the insurance companies, and they ask for what languages, for psychiatrists, or they ask what languages do you speak. So it's possible that the patients that I have, the Filipino American patients that come to my clinic, saw that I'm Filipino, that's why they came, that's one. And another thing to addressing the dosage of medication, I think it's important for us to participate in clinical trials of these medications. And I think they're starting to include Asian Americans and Filipinos now. I think they also did, I speak for Abilify, and I think they have a clinical trial group there in the Philippines. So Filipinos are now included in clinical trials of these different medications so that we're part of that whole group. We're part of the sample that they use in testing these medications. And I think it's important for us to be part of that testing.
All right.
Very quickly.
Wait a minute.
Diagnosis is one thing, but there are people who obviously need it, as my clients are victims of abuse and crime. But here's the observation I want to share. It's very difficult to pair them up with appropriate or matching professionals. My clients come from different parts of the world, and then I have to consult your kind for the purpose of helping the guys heal, and then using them as expert witnesses in court. Most of the time, I encounter doctors who say, I don't want to go to court. So that's the something that we need to present in this forum.
Okay, we have 2 more discussions to go, and I'm sure whatever questions you have, we can deal with them. But thank you very much, Dr. Rivera. Let's see application. So I really want to move these around because we still have 2 and a closing keynote speaker to do. So the next panel or the next discussion is about Kapwa Katipunan, the shared campus. I like that. Improving integration and coordination of care for Filipino Americans affected by mental health disorders. And with us to discuss and lead this discussion is Janice Manala. We just met her today. She has a lot of stories to share. You can read her bio here, the work that she does. But let's welcome Janice Manala.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So the interesting part of this conversation that we're having is that we're all similarly sort of saying the same thing. So every conversation that started from Dr. EJ, that they've been so up to now, they're all interconnected. So with that, I hope I'm not going to bore you with a little bit of all these details, but I think it's important to also kind of hone in back on some just historical things, but also how we can then share this campus together and coordinate the services. So, as a matter of fact, my background is I'm a clinician. I'm licensed here in the state of Virginia, also in Florida, DC, and hoping to be in Maryland. I've earned my doctorate in counselor education and supervision. So the difference is I'm not a psychologist, but I am a treating clinician. So there's a disparity in that with the 2 professions. So I don't test necessarily. What I do essentially is I talk through with an individual through their problem. Okay. So I'm definitely different from a psychiatrist as well. All right. So I just want to give you guys these off is that Filipinos are the 2nd largest U.S. immigrant population, and with the number 1 living in LA. So hello, LA. You guys are really important to us. But you know, the interesting part of it is that despite this size, we are described as the hidden minority in the United States. I wonder why. So this will all come together. Then the other part of it too is that it's been noted that for about almost 400 years of Spanish colonization, and then after that, we've also had the American influence, and then now we've become independent from all of that. So what I've said in some of my group discussion here is that we have an identity crisis. So it starts there. What's the conversation like at home? What is it shape that puts us together to say, okay, what makes me different from my neighbor who is other than Filipino, someone that's Indian, someone that's white, someone that's black. But ultimately, it doesn't change anything because we all have symptoms of depression. We all have symptoms of anxiety. And that could totally vary. And to Dr. Rivera, we're specifically talking about these very debilitating functioning things. But ultimately, there's a transition to as immigrants. My parents, I'm sure, were feeling quite depressed or feeling lost because they weren't sure how to navigate themselves through. You know what I mean? So they came up with, let's say, 10 other people in one apartment and lived together, and from that found their support system. So I'm sharing this with you because it's important to understand how then can we tether that to coordinate those services that we're trying to talk about. So the conversation starts with barriers. And so let me bring that up. The barriers is that Filipinos are often thought as, we're too prideful. It comes in with, am I good enough? I'm not sick. I'm okay. I got this. Then there's also lack of awareness of where to go. Then there's a belief system that they're saying, well, could they really help? Like my dad, for example, totally out of sidebar, but we're telling him, hey, Dad, why don't you get checked out? Talk about early intervention, talk about these things, talk about the senior citizen. He's like, no, I'm good. Hindi na. And so I'm clean. So just to keep that in mind. The other is negative messages from our family. Are you sure you're sick? Why? Why would you think that? So there's this negative connotation and negative feeling that's being provided. And so I think it also starts again, going back to conversation, is understanding that, how is that? It's very lack. So I'm going to go back to what Crystal was saying. Where are we headed towards? And I've always, personally, my own bias, I've always said, I'm more Latin than I am Asian. I don't eat with chopsticks. I wasn't taught that. I was taught with the spoon. So this is something to keep in mind, right? Or with my hands. So the negative messages often will then debilitate us as Filipinos, or in general, us as humans to get help, because it's that message of you're not good enough, something, you're not right. So with us as Catholics, I think the majority of Filipinos are raised Catholicism. And so with that high rate of value, it's almost like feeling guilty. Like, I don't know if I should really go out and ask for help. God's not going to approve of it. Or I'm going to get chastised for it if I open up this conversation. So just again, those values of those things of negative messages. And then there's fear. So again, fear comes also with that negative message of negative criticism. Something to think about. And then also the other, and last but not least, for most people, is the lack of quality time. So again, bringing in intergenerational and immigrants, is that families often, at least for mine as well, I can speak for myself, is that I didn't have much support. I think their support was, did you eat? Then I'm fine and done. Just go ahead and go to the kitchen. But my kind of support wasn't like what my friends received. They had dinner together, they had conversations, they had different things, but my family worked hard. It would be a joke if my island friends would say, you're like Jamaican, you have 2 to 3 jobs. You know what I mean? And so the conversation continues in that regard. And if I personally wasn't inquisitive about my behaviors and why things happened the way that they did, I don't think I would be able to be where I am today, because I had to open up that conversation, and I was identified, here's the negative message, is that my mother would chastise me to say, why are you being rebellious? Or asking her to say, why am I wearing this shirt to church? When I merely was just like, Mom, just tell me why you don't want me to wear this shirt. So there are these values and idiosyncrasies that we have to understand deep within, so the conversation has to start. So Last one is this bahala na attitude, right? So a lot of us, at any dialect, it's the same thing, bahala na. And so I say that is because a lot of my patients that, fortunately, that the Filipinos do come into my door, are often, they do say that. What does it mean? Oh, sorry, bahala na means like, it's okay, it's good, I got this. Give it to God, things like that. And then the other part of that too is it's a foresight of faith. So there's a lot of definitions into it, but ultimately it says it'll work out, it will be fine. Okay, I'm getting the signs from. So here's the conversation in order to start with, coordination and integration. So how do we then apply those things that I have said in terms of barriers of what the actual client, the patient comes in to me? Because it takes them a while to actually understand that something is wrong. And it doesn't have to be a very clinical, like debilitating thing. It could literally be transition. Coming in from simply, an example, Filipino male, and he recently just got let go of his job. And he's been working there diligently for 20 years. So now he's like, where do I go? Dr. Man, like, where do I go? So again, so those are those things, the scope of this conversation, hopefully this discussion, to lead us to say, with everything that's been from the beginning to up to now, to say, how do we then coordinate these services to be effective, impactful, but it also leaves that conversation open.
Thank you, Janice. I think this is the Janice Obey. I wish we had more time. The most difficult job today belongs to the timekeeper because it's been waiting, waiting. Nothing personal against the speakers, but I think you have the most difficult and unenviable job today. Just so you know. All right, now, for the next 10-15 minutes, we're going to go back to the small group discussions, and this time talk about collaboration. How do you collaborate? What does collaboration look like? All right? I'm sure you are leaders of collaborative organizations, you've worked with people before, so this discussion is focused on how to achieve connectedness, collaboration. So, go back to your small groups, designate a spokesperson, write notes, and we'll give you about 10 minutes to do this, right? Okay. Go.
I mean, Medicare, Medicare patients and, well, in my practice, private. Well, they have to have the 80% of the level of Medicare, so they have their responsibility for the 20%, and they're still paying. Oh, that's expensive, yeah. And usually sometimes insurance doesn't cover
Okay, try to wrap it up in 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Navigate, will help us navigate insurance. Without somebody to pay that.
All right. Let's try to wrap up and let's hear sharing from the different groups. Okay? All right, who wants to start and share? Who's ready to share? What group? All right, the nurses are ready. The nursing group. All right, first 10 cards.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Christian. I am from PSC. One actually very big conversation that we just had is kind of the disconnect in the access to resources in terms of insurance. We had a discussion about how some insurances, like kind of like questioning like how much of the benefits is able to be used for mental health services. And basically what we're saying is that a lot of the times Filipinos find that, okay, well, we were saying how like early detection when it comes to children, early detection should start at home. And we already talked about how, yeah, communication is a big thing and it needs to be an open thing. But then when it does come to, okay, let's do something about it. And then once you're there, we're hit with a wall where insurance doesn't really pay for it, or like there's a lot of limitations. And then where we would have to end up paying for out of pocket, and you know our financial status as a community, it's not the best. So, or for some of us at least, it's not always the same. So we are met with that wall. And what we were discussing is hopefully organizations or efforts that really like try to connect community members that do struggle with, like getting access to resources to, connect them to getting those resources. So I think that's one way that we can work on that connectedness is really, just, yeah, collaborate and really like, that's kind of like nitty gritty of just insurance in general, like healthcare, and being able to bridge that. That's it.
Good, thank you. All right, so this is all about collaboration. How are you collaborating? Next group, ready to report here? Okay, this group's reporting. Who's reporting? Austin Chavez.
Talk about like how before we can even like build Kapwa and mental health, like we have to learn how to build Kapwa in general. And I think I said something about how, like I love what Dr. EJ said about intersectionality, because you can go to a room with 100 Filipinos and you're Filipino and still feel left out. I specifically said like when I thought of intersectionality, I thought about being gay and Filipino and how sometimes it can feel like Kapwa with transition. And so, I guess like we talk about like how do we achieve Kapwa collaboration and how do we centering people and making that like a normal part of the community. So like in my I'm a student, so in my like campus organizing, like we make a big deal out of like community guidelines. Like why can't like mental health services do that as well? Community guidelines will center you as a person, so you don't have to feel like you represent the community, even though you're part of the community, but you can also like represent the community. So yeah.
All right, so awesome. Campus organizing, that's a lot of collaboration right there. All right, next group. All right. Samantha Dizon. Samantha, go Samantha.
So our group was talking about, this is actually a great first step, bringing different organizations together to have these conversations and to be able to just bring back what we learned to our own communities and communicating what our community's needs are on a national level. We also talked about creating like a list of resources that we could disseminate to like our local communities, and really like explaining what the differences in these resources are, because there's a therapist, there's a clinician, like what's the difference in like what would an individual need from their own.
Great, that's one synergy in that group. Okay. Next group, ready? Collaborations.
We're not ready.
Connectedness. Were you collaborating?
We didn't finish our conversation, but I do want to share some of what we had opportunity to talk about. And the first was a reflection on the dialogue here and a reminder from our first presenter of how important culture, language, and tradition is for collaboration, and how vulnerable we are as a group for not remembering culture, language, and tradition even in this conversation. So that part of it feels like it's grounded in indigenous values, and part of it sounds like it's grounded in very Western Filipino practice. So we're encouraging everyone to remember the Filipino part of the Filipino American experience. And with that, had some very dynamic exchange in the moment. So I and as a result of some of the connections to the universities that were represented in our group, had an opportunity to start to move the knowledge that's being lifted here back to campus services and to really challenge them to think forward about being more inclusive and comprehensive in how Filipino American students are involved and supported through their resources.
Well, thank you for this insight. Yeah, you're right. I think it was EJ who said, remembering can be dangerous. Right, EJ? Our last group.
Hi, I'm Jasmine, and I'm a student at Oakland University. And most of our conversation really was based around like the adults here who are very empathetic. They're very knowledgeable about mental illnesses, mental disorders, and mental health in general, and the huge gap and disparity between those who really aren't, which in reality is the type of adults that a lot of people my age or even younger are really around. And so one of the things that we talked about was really just the people here, that the adults here, importantly, using their voice for advocating for the youth and for the elderly also, because as much as we would like to use our voice, one, it's very hard. And when we do try, sometimes it's very unsuccessful because the parent and child dynamic, it's not equal or balanced at all. So one of the things that we did talk about was the importance of mentorship programs that are really Filipino focused because in reality, we don't really have much of that. I know there's a couple of that within like the West Coast because there's a really large population of Filipinos there. But on the East Coast, as far as I know, it's little to none really. So having adults to really guide the youth and even just validate and how they feel and in what they do is, I think, a really, really important, crucial, and vital thing to growth and also just wellness and mental health. So, yeah.
Okay. All the groups recorded. Everybody recorded, right? Great. Okay, we're moving right along because we're a little behind by about 5-10 minutes. Right? We're on time now. Oh, great. You're wonderful. Okay. Filipinos have a way of adjusting and making it on time. All right, for our last discussion, we're going to have a focus on bayanihan resilience or community strength, increasing prevention, assessment, and treatment of mental health disorders in emergency response settings. And for us to joining us today to share her insight is Miriam Rittmiller. I've known Miriam for a long time. She's an immigration lawyer, she's a community leader, she's a member, president of the Philippine American, I think the first Filipino president of the Philippine American Bar Association. Let's welcome Miriam Rittmiller. And Miriam, you have 5 minutes.
In 5 minutes, that was the best. So I brought my entourage, my mama, and I brought and bring the pictures of resiliency. So I brought words, I brought pictures. I found a way to make it shorter. Thank you for asking. This is my mother, Abigail Bustamante, for senior assistant and my trusted assistant, Kai. Pictures of resiliency in time. Bring it up. Bayanihan. So when we were talking about bayanihan, I think a lot of you don't really know that it's about moving houses. People go together, carry the houses and move it and they party. And today we're moving mental health forward to bayanihan. And the American picture of resiliency to me is the Golden Gate Bridge. It was done in the Depression when there was no money, no technology, but they believed. So they did it, and now we have the Golden Gate Bridge. Thank you so much, my family. You can now have your tea. Thank you. So thank you, John, for introducing me. I wear 2 hats to bring to you the message about resiliency. First, as an immigration lawyer, grown and honed by John Henry Rito, I have met. Oh, thank you. I have met and seen depression in the eyes of my clients who are victims of abuse or victims of crimes, and I have to help them not only move their case forward, but also find them mental health specialists, which is a very big task to do because Filipinos don't really want to go see doctors for this issue. And then there are doctors who are hesitant, they don't want to come to court with me to be experts. They just want to give you the paper. And then there's about compatibility. American doctors really don't understand the issues of criminal prevention. And so, from Glory, which is Global Red Hearts LLC, which I organize, we help communities and individuals become successful through relationship building and resiliency is our program through culture, arts, and sports. We gotta move forward. Now, as far as assessment is concerned, there are guideposts that we formulated for Glory, and you look at loss, change, stagnation, or status quo. These 3 factors tell you in advance that there is mental health issues coming forward and that resiliency, our product, is one of the factors that can help address the issues. And loss can be positive or negative. Loss can be death. It could be loss of a job, separation or divorce. But loss can be positive. You lose a penalty. You lose your indebtedness, things like that. In any case, loss brings trauma and stress that needs to be addressed through resiliency programs. Change is also something like graduating to college is a positive change that brings on anxiety. Then getting married is positive, but then you have in-laws you have to deal with, and having children is a positive thing. Every time you have grace, I heard a pastor say, remember there's going to be some kind of a burden attached to it, and you need to get it done. At any rate, moving forward, the key points of prevention would be to see the signs, see the loss, the change, the stagnation that needs to be addressed. And in order to do that, I didn't do a good job in having the paperwork because it's a lot. Now, I want to go to the conclusion, move it forward. I have resources that are listed in the PowerPoint, and we identified certain things that are helpful to form resiliency programs. There would be hotlines for a lot of stress factors. There would be pro bono lawyers, there would be free clinicians, there would be places where you can have free fun, swimming and chess playing, etc. Financial literacy resources are also great resources to relieve mental stress and anxieties. And so, in summary, we at Glory, we have done resiliency programs for communities, businesses, organizations, and individuals, and we formulated this mantra, case law of resiliency, C for culture, A for art, S for sports, E for education. And I invite all of you to ask ourselves, what have I done in order to address mental health and to build resiliency? We go within and we ask what I have done. And all of you have different ways of doing it. So in conclusion, mental health and resiliency is not just a word. It is a picture, a moving picture. And most of all, I want to leave you with this imagery. My image of stress and resiliency is sailing on a ship, and it's broken while you're on the middle of the sea, and you need to repair it using the same materials on the ship without going on shore. So that is the challenge of using resiliency programs in order to combat the issues of mental health. So thank you very much to all of you for generously allowing me to contribute my experiences with the help of the community that's nurtured me and welcomed me. Mabuhay to everybody. God bless you.
Thank you, Miriam. We know where to find you. Your logo is just Janice too. So anyway, this is our last discussion before we go to the closing keynote. So I think it's been effectively demonstrated that when you gather together and collaborate on your tables, that you come up with very brilliant ideas. So let's go back to the format, go back to your groups, and the question that you need to answer is what issues impact the mental health of Filipino Americans? How have we, or how can we champion the spirit of bayanihan to promote healing and resilience? So we need your strategies, your specific suggestions, concrete ideas, because these are going to be very helpful as we continue our mental health education program here in the community. So you have about 10 minutes.
No, I think
For me, it's like, our culture is very easy that, looking on as like, our city will like, experiences are also like, coming from an Asian kind of culture, are not always like,
And if that thing from within is not moving, nothing is operating. And a lot of people use it that we need each other. But
sometimes like, what did I do wrong? You know?
we didn't move. It's a stigma. You say,
I want to be, have that.
Very step out of the comfort zone and say, you know what? I myself is suffering from this depression, medication. Inspire me to be calm. As a result, when I think of people, the effect of that reverberates. So now, what do we do? We think that self-power come out of me. The only way we would be able to look at not only ourselves as bite-sized, you know, bite-tiny and bite-sized, you know, but we need to move yourself in order to come. That's how I think.
I think it's difficult to find that people can change. Not unless there is some kind of center wherein we can more would allow people to come in to get more educated. I think for people to change, they need some kind of education. So it's a Filipino center organization actually be attractive to people for make change in that. What I mean, that's how I see it. Create a organization. It is international organization. Yeah, but what is non-profit organization? Like local communities, but a national organization. With like all these different community organizations to have a common so in the community, maybe a local organization, and that local organization to connect with the regional organization, regional organization. So everything would be all of us, all these moving parts moving together.
And that's how the HHS community organizations, the assistance for health, when we work with those Even the ones that just work hard, but we don't know. We do have resources. Like, I look at when I live with a lady, we have teachers that come to me, and they say nothing. But you have the people struggle with how you regiment with like so that mental health can be
Right, 1 minute, brother, 1 minute.
Yeah, there are a lot of moving parts. Start with individual. Individual going to the community, this is like the community. Individual. And from the community, make sure that all these moving parts. Trickling down into regional. And I'm sticking, a little biased to that now.
All right. As we over here, you got a very great ideas. So let's wrap it up and let's share some of those strategies and ideas that you have come up with. So who's ready to report? Who's ready to report? Who wants to go first? All right, Christian? All right, let's wrap it up. Christian goes first, then you go next. All right, let's listen to Christian.
Okay, hi everyone, it's Christian again. We had a lot of also good discussion again. But really kind of the most common theme is really the activation of self. I think it really starts from you, especially from people like us here in the space where we do have the resources and opportunities to really talk and learn about these things, for us to be able to activate that value of IDEA to go beyond, because mental health and mental illness is such an individualized thing that you deal with personally, that it needs to go beyond that and really reaching out to the community in sharing your personal experiences and then moving together to collaborate and to advocating for those who don't have access, or for those who are kind of like in the darkness, or who are in silence, who are not as educated or as informed. And through that collaboration, that's when we can, reach out to different organizations or national organizations or policymakers that can make the change to really bridge the gap to, improve our mental health outcomes. So that's pretty much it. But it also starts from courage.
Courage.
It's like from here. So kind of like really a culmination of all the values that we talked about in our discussion.
Great, starts from courage. All right, thank you. Everybody? All right.
Hi, City, and we talked about some of the. Some of the issues in the Filipino American community, obviously I'm not Filipino, so I don't know firsthand, but some of them that we discussed were financial issues and intercommunity issues and immigration issues, discrimination issues, et cetera, et cetera. And generally to combat those issues, first, legislation, getting in touch with people who have power in their communities who can advocate for Filipino Americans to push through these issues and to make sure that these issues are accounted for. Also, again, having a community, having people you can talk to, having people you can go to, and creating programs within your community that work for Filipino Americans. That also helps them and encourage them to want to make mental illness a topic of conversation, because it's very important, and make it something that isn't just like, well, she's mentally ill. No, it's like something, okay, this is an issue that we can address, this is an issue that we can move forward to, and just making it easier for people to be able to come out about it and be able to want to address those issues firsthand and make it normal. Don't just, make mental illness something that you push it aside and it's just there. No, make it something that's a normal conversation, make it something that you guys can openly talk about.
All right, next part is topical normal conversation. All right, who's next?
The best group is here.
The best group is here. Are you part of this group or? All right, Jason?
Yeah.
All right.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Tinko with Napa. Our group talked about a few things. First, about kind of the stigma with parenting that oftentimes parents feel that, if their children have mental health issues, that it's a reflection of their parenting. So feeling kind of judged, or the guilt or the shame and kind of that, and how we kind of can tackle that as an issue. Also, we talked about kind of the pressures from the Philippines, and if there's added mental health issues with having the pressure of like giving back to the Philippines, things like that, how that contributes to us, coupled with the colonialism that we've also had to deal with as a community too, and as a culture. And then just back to EJ's point earlier about the wheel is broken, and how we really address that. And one of the things that we talked about was the role that either schools can play, between the relationships with students, parents, administrators. We talked about how, growing up, it wasn't really something that we talked about in the school setting as well, and how that can kind of be implemented. And also churches. Obviously, Filipino Americans, we're very Catholic and things like that. So what role can also churches, and that help play in mental health?
All right. Schools, churches, any place you go, karaoke bars. All right. This group? Armin, Aaron.
Hi everyone, my name is Aaron Hill. I'm actually from a lead, Asian American lead. Previously, I worked with Filipino Educational Partnerships in San Francisco. So a lot of things that I have learned living in San Francisco, I actually had the privilege of working with Vinilstep Studios, which is actually kind of like the theater arts epicenter of Filipino arts. And a lot of what we were talking about is like, when we talk about mental health, we talk about self, but we also want to talk about how we as a community kind of lift each other. So the idea of theater and performing arts, for example, in the next couple of weeks, they are doing a production called Chasing Papeles, which is a story about a family moving to San Francisco and really talking about like, you know, the idea of working in different care homes and the ideals of like how the trauma and everything that goes on in that person's like transition from the Philippines and going into a certain job. So like she wrote that with her mother in hopes to talk about it with her family and her community. So it definitely, when I watched it the first time, she said that it was an opportunity for her to tell her tell her family what was going on. And it was really, sometimes it's really hard to have that discussion with her family, but through the arts, through how she told her story, she was able to have a really good, healthy conversation and have her family really, really think about like, hey, this person's really going through that. So yeah, just the idea of the community, bringing the arts, for example, like with working with youth, a lot of times they don't have the opportunity to articulate what they're feeling. So like a lot of times we use poetry, poetry, theater, a lot of times we're talking about too. So yes.
Great. Speaking of the arts, I'm going to make a shameless plug here because we are actually going to present Hibla at Habi next Saturday, and this is in line with what DJ said. Let's promote our indigenous consciousness, our arts and culture. So don't miss it, be there. All right, who's next? Can we call everybody? Jen. Yes.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Dawes from University of Maryland and HRSA.
Oh, HRSA.
So, speaking of bionican, which is sort of a value that we promote, Christian brought up some other values like honorable, gratitude, and there's also harmony and others. And I mentioned something that I learned from the psychologist that EJ mentioned. What's his last name again? Enriquez. So I find him very difficult to read, but I did learn something. And that was that some of our values were, all of our values actually have a context, and many of them were formed in the context of colonialism. So that some of those values, while they might have been useful when we were colonized, may not be useful anymore. So like, you know, trying to always promote harmony might have worked when we had, you know, someone watching over us all the time and we had to behave. And so now we have to think about it a little differently because we're in a different context. So, we have to be critical about what we promote as tradition. That and the other thing that we mentioned was sort of the interconnectedness with other communities of color and learning from each other in the ways that we address our mental health.
Thank you, Jen. Okay, we actually, surprise, we actually have a few minutes before we call on our keynote speaker. So if there are other ideas that we have not, that maybe you think should be raised, this is your time to also raise them. So we have a few minutes to do that. Why? Wow.
Jasmine.
Well, it looks like.
Jasmine.
Oh, Justin. All right.
From last year, we did mention interconnecting us with other people of color. And I think that is really important as Filipinos with the prideful thinking. We do tend to kind of isolate ourselves and think that we're the other. And if, to some extent, I mean, you are correct, but I do think that in order for us to really reach the capacity of outreach and really prevention that we're aiming for, we do need to reach out to other communities because that's the way to getting the word out. So reaching out to other communities, part of the Latinx communities or the Black community, I think it's really important because as much as our experiences are different, they're very similar in accommodation, the trauma that we experience coming here to Western world. In that context is very similar. So I think to really reach the point of justice and equity within mental health, specifically for this forum, it is very critical that we reach out and communicate.
actually, that's one of our strengths. Filipinos are known to get along well with everybody, right? That's why, non-Filipinos join Filipino clubs because they like Filipinos. Not only the food, but, the fellowship and the camaraderie. So this is a strength, and I think you have articulated very well how this can be amplified in our collaboration work. You could also react to the other discussions that we did this morning before we go to our keynote. If there are any outstanding questions that maybe you think we have not addressed. Otherwise, I'm going to call on our good friend, Kevin Nadal, to give us our closing keynote. I know Kevin Nadal for a long time, and the first time I actually had a interaction with him was when ABC had this controversial Desperate Housewives episode. I don't know whether you all heard of Desperate Housewives. It was Kevin who brought it to my attention, and as you know, there was a national outcry about it, and thanks to Kevin, this was addressed. And I don't know if this is still an ongoing problem, but I'm sure Kevin has a lot of thoughts on it. But let's welcome Kevin Nadal.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. When I say Mabu, you say hi. Mabu. Mabu. When I say Mabu, you say hey. Mabu. Mabu. All right. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you to Crystal and Ryan and to the team and to Steve John. This is something that makes my heart really happy because even just 10 years ago, something like this wouldn't have been possible because we weren't having these sorts of conversations about mental health, about psychology, and particularly about the intersection of being Filipino and understanding some of these issues. So the title of my talk is called Let's Get Information. This is a title of a Beyonce song, but I'd like to think of Beyonce as my best friend. So I'm borrowing from her, but also it became something that I wrote in the American Psychologist as a way for psychologists to recognize the need for us to also become activists. And so as we talk today, I would like for folks to think about what would that mean for you to be a blank activist, whether it is a practitioner activist, a scholar activist, a psychologist activist, a social worker activist, and how would this be something that we can do in order to better promote mental health in our Filipino American communities. So next slide, please. I like to always start out by recognizing those who have come before us. I think to say maraming salamat to the revolutionaries, especially our Filipino trailblazers who have really gotten us to where we are today. I'd like to particularly acknowledge Larry Young and Philip Cruz, who were labor activists, part of the United Farm Workers, which then became one of the most successful labor movements in the United States and in world history. I personally like to also acknowledge our queer and trans people of color who have fought for us to be where we are today, people like Audre Lorde, James Baldwin, Sylvia Rivera, Washington Johnson. I also want to acknowledge Wewa and other indigenous people, and to the indigenous people whose lands we are on today. We're merely occupants of their land, and so we must honor and respect and ask for permission to be here. Next slide. I'd like to say thank you to the trailblazers who I personally met. People like Fred Cordova and Auntie Dorothy Cordova, my friend Auntie Dorothy, the founders of the Filipino American National Historical Society. They are the reason why we celebrate October as Filipino American History Month. It is Filipino American History Month, not Filipino American Heritage Month, not Philippine Heritage Month, Filipino American History Month. And the reason why I emphasize that is because there's a huge difference between celebrating heritage and history. And the month was intended to celebrate the Filipino Americans who have made major contributions to American history. That Filipino American history is American history. And that we need to recognize that we've been here in the United States for hundreds and hundreds of years, even before the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. And so when people think about Filipino Americans in the US, it isn't just that we just are recent arrivals, but that we actually have been here for quite some time. I like to honor people like the professors, the Filipino American professors. There are so few of us here in this country. So people like PJ David and Alison Santiago Gonzalez, people like Robert Rodriguez, Dina Maramba. These are folks who have paved the way for us to know that Filipino American studies is important for us, and that there are some now research that shows that ethnic studies is a predictor of mental health. And so if we have people who study the things that we are interested in, that study our experiences, and we learn about those things, that could actually improve our mental health. And so I thank trailblazers like them. I finally want to acknowledge some of the trailblazer Filipino American psychologists that EJ mentioned earlier today. People like Maria Roots, Linda Revilla, Alvin Alvarez, Len Strobel, and so many others who really fought for Filipino Americans to have a voice in psychology. They existed when I was a graduate student, and their work was present, but there really wasn't a comprehensive look at Filipino American psychology. And so when people like EJ, people like Krista Cronister and Alicia Del Prado, Christine Capitone, and all these other folks were really trying to build what it means to have the study of Filipino American psychology, the practice of Filipino American psychology. And so I recognize those who come before us. Next slide, please. I'd like to say thank you to my parents. My parents immigrated here to the United States in the 1960s. My mom first came here in 1963 as part of the nursing program. She first immigrated to Illinois, and she worked at Cook County Hospital in Chicago. My mom, because it was before 1963, we believe is one of the few Filipinos that were able to immigrate during that 3-decade period of time. Because prior to 1965, there was a quota on the number of Filipinos who could come to this country. And that quota for Filipinos and most other Asian countries was 50 people per country of those Asian countries that could come to the United States. So that would be like as if this room was the number of Filipinos who would come in any given year to the US. Versus recognizing that a country like Germany was allowed to have 57,000 people come in any given year prior to 1965. So why is it that the quota for Asian people was much smaller versus for people in Germany to be much larger? And for us to remember this historical context, because when we see what's happening in our country today, and some of the decisions and policies that are being made, that we recognize that while these policies might not directly impact Filipinos, they have directly impacted us in the past. And so for us to know that if we ignore what's happening today, and we don't advocate for social justice, we don't advocate for equities in other communities, that we're really dishonoring our own people and our own histories. And so to recognize that our history is something that we can use to empathize with and advocate for others. My parents also are really important to me because they sacrificed everything they had for me to come to this country. They grew up in poverty in Aklan, Philippines, where they had very little and they didn't even have running water when they were growing up. My parents were both children of World War II, and so they saw a lot of different atrocities, a lot of violence. They saw people die and get killed, and they came to the United States in search of the American dream, like many Filipinos do, and I think it's something just to reflect on for especially younger Filipino Americans who are second or third generation, to just think about just that idea of leaving your own country in a time when technology wasn't very sophisticated, knowing that you might not possibly see some of your family ever again, but to leave all of that because of this idea of the American dream. This idea that your children, or in my parents' case, your hypothetical children that didn't even exist, would have a better life if you left everything behind. And so that's what my parents did for me, and that they were able to provide so many things that they would not have been able to in the Philippines. And so I honor and acknowledge them. I also acknowledge my husband, RJ Caligohano, who's in this photo. Some people will say, well, he likes to say that he is the second luckiest man alive, and that I'm allegedly the luckiest. But without my parents' support, without my husband's support, without my family's support, I wouldn't be standing here in front of you today. Next slide, please. I especially want to honor Dr. Dambo Halana Mabalo, who we lost in August. She was a professor of history at San Francisco State University. She wrote the book, Little Vanillas in the Heart, the history of Filipino town in Stockton. She also wrote Filipinos in Stockton, and really advocated for understanding our history as Filipino Americans. She was the national trustee of the Filipino American National Historical Society. She was also a scholar, an activist, a poet, a writer, a historic preservationist. When Manila was about to be destroyed, she and her colleague Dylan Delbo fought for it to be turned into a historical landmark in Southern California. She was a college student or a recent college graduate when that happened. And so I say that because she didn't have the letters behind her name at that point, and yet she was able to accomplish such a great and heroic act. Our community has had such a loss with her no longer with us, but what I hope we all learn is that we too have what it takes for us to really be activists, to advocate for our communities. Dr. Mabalan was a scholar activist. She was somebody that didn't just hide behind the ivory tower. She was somebody who just wrote books. She was somebody who was integrated into the community. She was somebody who could write an amazing essay and get it published and then go to the adobo cook-off right after. She was somebody who I always aspired to be like and will continue to aspire to be like, and that I hope that even if you've never met her personally, that you take the way that she lived as a way to also live your life, to be vocal, to be loud, to stand up for what's right, to not care about what other people think if it's going to get in the way of you advocating for justice. And so I honor Dr. Mabalan, and I dedicate this presentation to her. Next slide, please. So it is Filipino American History Month, and like I mentioned, we emphasize history over heritage. We can celebrate our heritage at any given time. We celebrate our heritage every single day. We especially celebrate our heritage in June when we celebrate Philippine Independence Day. But history is important, and American history is important. Filipino American history is important. Filipinos first landed here in 1587 before the United States was even the United States. Filipino Americans have contributed significantly to our American history, from the labor movement and the United Farm Workers to Filipinos serving in the many wars, especially World War II, and the veterans who very recently were able to get their Congressional Gold Medals thanks to people like General Taguba, as well as Ben de Guzman, who I saw is over here. I want to give Ben de Guzman a big round of applause for assisting with that Filipino veteran. Filipino American history are the fact that Filipinos have been here in terms of athleticism. People like Vicky Chavez, who received her first gold medal in 1938, the first Pinay to receive a gold medal. People who have been in arts and entertainment, Filipinos who have been educators and activists. We have so many heroes that don't get taught in our history books. And so this is why we need to be the ones to tell their stories. This is why Filipino American History Month was created, so that we have control of our narrative. We have control of what we teach our children. And if our children from very young age learn that being Filipino American is important, and it's something to be proud of, it's something to be celebrated, then maybe we're already providing them with that resilience that they need in order to thrive and to be the successful Filipino Americans that they can be. So when I celebrate Filipino American History Month, we're not just celebrating fun facts, we're also protecting and uplifting future generations. And so to really be mindful of this whenever we celebrate this month, and also when we uplift our communities throughout the entire year. Next slide. So I want to just share a little bit about myself. Whenever people do research, I like to say that it's really research because you're really talking about what's important to you. And for you to understand some of the things that I talk about today, I want to share with you all why they're important to me. So like I mentioned, my parents immigrated here first in the 1960s, and I am the youngest of their 3 children, obviously the cutest. I mean, come on, look at that bold haircut, it's amazing. But as a Filipino American, second generation, born and raised here in the United States, I grew up very bicultural. Being bicultural means that you knew what it meant to be Filipino, that being Filipino in the home meant eating Filipino food, hearing your parents speak Filipino languages, it meant honoring your elders, it meant going to family parties, it meant having hundreds of cousins with only 20 of them you were actually related to. That was being Filipino. Being American meant adjusting once I left my house. once I left my cousins or aunties or Lola's house. And when I went to school and learning how to be part of my peers, learning to like things that were considered very American, watching Saturday morning cartoons, understanding the language, the trends, the fads, understanding how to speak English with a perfect accent. This is what it meant to be American. And then to be Filipino American is a combination of those two things. Being Filipino American is balancing being Filipino and being American, and adjusting your identities based on the context in which you are in. It means code switching. Code switching means knowing that in some cases I can be very Filipino, in other places I may not be able to be as Filipino, or I might need to acknowledge other parts of my identity, or use those as a way of getting along with people or understanding people. And code switching is something that's a phenomenon that I still struggle with as somebody who's a grown adult, but it was something that I learned when I was 6 years old. When I was 6 years old, I code switched every single day, knowing that there were certain things that I can say or do with my family, my Filipino peers, that I couldn't do at school. And so I think we need to acknowledge just the stressors of being bicultural from a very early age, and that we need to protect our children by teaching them about how to do these things, even when they might not even realize what's happening, because they're learning about these different things. I imagine everyone in the room can think about the first time they ever felt different, and especially the first time they ever felt different because of their race. What if you had a parent or a authority figure or somebody in your life who had prepared you for that moment? Would you have felt as different as you did that day? Would you have been able to be resilient in a different way than you were prepared to? And would that then change the trajectory of your life? And so to think about the ways that we can prepare our children in strengthening their ethnic identities, preparing them for the racism and discrimination that they may potentially experience, so that then can give them the confidence that they need to become the best people that they can be. Next slide, please. As an 80s child of immigrants, I just love showing my kid pictures. Part of it is when I came out to my parents in my 20s, my mom's like, oh my gosh, I did not know you were gay. And I said, really, Mom? And like serving like, here's some fabulous 5-year-old over here. I got that hands-on hip triangle pose on the right. But this is where intersectionality is coming. Not only was it difficult or a struggle to balance being Filipino American, but now I also felt different because of my gender expression and my sexual orientation. And it wasn't even about sexual orientation back then. It was just that I knew that I was different, that maybe I didn't like girls, or maybe that my life trajectory would be different as a result of that. To balance all of that took a toll on my mental health. When I was 6 years old and knowing that I was different, to feel like that I would have to hide who I was, or to be told that I couldn't be who I was, or to be told that I was different, to be called a butler, or to be called, something like a lot of horrible things that other kids have called me during that time, that shaped who I was as a person. And so those were some of the struggles that I had with mental health, was not just that I balanced being Filipino and American, but I also felt ashamed to be who I really was. Growing up brown led to another type of identity experience for me. So not only did I struggle with being Filipino and American, I also learned what it meant to be a person of color in the United States, and what it meant to be a Filipino American as a person of color in the United States. I've heard people talk here today about not feeling necessarily connected to other Asian Americans, feeling more connections with African Americans and Latino, Latinx people, and that's something that's a very common experience. So research has supported throughout the years that Filipinos tend to build coalitions with other non-Asian American people of color, and that might be because of some of the similar experiences that they might have. It also might be because there are hierarchies within Asian American communities that are oftentimes not talked about. That to be East Asian equates being Asian, and to be brown Asian, meaning being Filipino, being South Asian, being Southeast Asian, is always an afterthought. The movie is called Crazy Rich Asians for a reason, because that's who they equate as being Asian, East Asian. When we think about Filipinos, oftentimes we're not considered Asian enough. And so these were the types of messages that I learned. I learned that I was brown, which is something that is very much a unique part of Filipino American experience, that we identify with a skin color because that's something that is part of how people treat us. Being Filipino American means that sometimes people don't know what the fuck you are. That I can walk down the streets and people might presume that I am Asian in general. I might walk into another context and people start speaking Spanish to me. I walk to another context and somebody will ask me what tribe I'm in. These are all things that have happened to me. And research has found have happened to lots of Filipinos that were mistaken for lots of different things. And so while it might not seem like a big deal, it then accumulates over time and then leads to potential mental health issues, potential identity-related issues, potential stressors that you don't want to deal with. And this is why I study microaggressions. It's because being the target of so many different microaggressions, it became something for me to want to study. And through my work, we found that microaggressions in general affect people of different historically marginalized groups, affect things like their mental health, their physical health, their self-esteem, their trauma symptoms, but also recognizing that for Filipino Americans, there's a unique type of experience with microaggressions, where we experience microaggressions that all sorts of groups experience. So for example, there are certain types of microaggressions that East Asians experience on their own or that are unique to East Asians that are very different than types of microaggressions that Black people might experience. Well, Filipinos, we experience all of these types of microaggressions. And so in that way, it becomes something that could be even more of a stressor for us. In high school is where I learned that I got along better with my Black peers, with my Chicano peers at the time, and that they understood me more than a lot of my East Asian peers did. And so this became part of my identity development. Being intersectional is something that's really important. I'm glad that we're having these conversations. So being intersectional means that I might not necessarily feel completely at ease in any place in my life. I can join something like the Center for LGBTQ Studies, which is the oldest university-based LGBTQ center in the country, and I was the first executive director of color in its 25-year history. I then was part of the Asian American Psychological Association, which is the oldest national organization that focuses on Asian American mental health. I was the second Filipino American president and the first openly gay, queer president of the APA in its 45-year history. And so in understanding your different intersectional identities, to know that people might not feel comfortable going to certain places because they don't see that it's something that is as celebrated or as accepted or as talked about. And so maybe we do need to be really intentional in creating the spaces in which people feel included. And sometimes that takes the leaders to be able to acknowledge what some of the dynamics are in those organizations already. And similar to what Dr. David talked about before, to acknowledge if your organization is Tagalog-centric, to acknowledge if your organization is more patriarchal, to acknowledge if your organization focuses more on first-generation experiences versus second-generation experiences. These are the types of things that we can do to make organizations more inclusive. And then sometimes what happens when you have intersectional identities is even beyond joining these organizations and trying to fit in, sometimes we feel the need to create our own organizations. And so with this, we have the LGBTQ Scholars of Color Network, which I created, founded a couple of years ago for people who identified as both LGBTQ and people of color in the academy. Now we have hundreds of members that have been going to our biennial conferences, and this is a place where perhaps we feel safer because all of our identities are being uplifted. And so to recognize that sometimes that if there are not spaces for you, that you might need to create your own. Next slide, please. I became a full professor a couple of years ago, and I say this not to boast, but rather to acknowledge that there are so few Filipino American professors in the United States. I showed a picture of some of us, but there are so few of us. A study by Dina Maramba and myself in 2011 found that there were less than 150 Filipino American professors in the United States that were tenured or tenure track. Out of those, only 50 were tenured, and out of those, only 20 were full professors. So full professors is one of the highest ranks that you can get into in academia, and that there were 20 of us in the United States. That's not a lot. And so for us to think about what are some of the barriers that prevent Filipino Americans from entering academia, what are some of the barriers that prevent Filipino Americans from succeeding in academia, and how can we create different systems and models where we can encourage for more Filipinos to enter these fields. To know that it's not just academia, we see this across all different sectors. How many Filipino American attorneys are there? How many Filipino Americans in the arts are there? Why are we not as represented as we could be? Given that we are the second or third largest Asian American group, or the second immigrant group in the U.S., why aren't we becoming more visible in relation to that? And so to think about that when you go back to your different organizations, what we can do to uplift people to enter more of these roles. Next, please. Being the first is something that's really hard. Being the first is something that is something beyond what people even think about when they do things. Being the first is stressful. I oftentimes get celebrated for being the first person to do this, the first person to do that, first person in my family to get a PhD, first person to write a book on Filipino American psychology, first person in my family to make a certain salary. And these are all things that we celebrate. And my thing is that, one, we need to acknowledge that the people who become the first aren't just the first on their own, but that it took the backing of so many people for them to get there. And two, that we need to acknowledge that we're far or that there needs to be a time where we no longer just celebrate the first, because we have seconds, thirds, fourths, and fifths, that becomes normalized for us to enter these different positions, and that it becomes something that is achievable for all of us. For some of us who are the first, there's a lot of pressure to do all these different things. But perhaps if there were more of us that work collectively, then we would have more opportunities for us to really be able to create this community that we are looking for. So my research focuses on Filipino American issues and psychology. I wrote Filipino American Psychology, a handbook of theory, research, and clinical practice. Dr. David wrote Filipino American Post-Colonial Psychology with a second edition called Brown Skin, White Minds. And together we started to just really write about issues related to Filipino American mental health issues. And so together we wrote about things like colonial mentality and microaggressions and gender and sexual orientation issues. And EJ's written about health-seeking behaviors and cultural mistrust. And I've written about health issues affecting Filipino Americans. And there are other people who have written similar types of things. But to know that there's still very few of us that do this sort of research. And so for me to really try to advocate for more of us to go into this research, something that's really important to me. Because EJ and I graduated with our doctorate about 10 years ago, and we still don't see this next generation entering the field as much as we would like them to. And so for us to think again about how are we promoting for our younger generations to do this sort of work. And so not just with Filipino American psychology, but Filipino Americans in social work, Filipino Americans in counselor education, Filipino Americans in any other number of helping professions, that we need to have more visibility. Next slide, please. I like to talk about my own struggles with mental health and with internalized depression. I don't know if there's another photo that pops up. There you go. I show these photos because I know that I've struggled with mental health issues throughout my life. And part of me realizes that experiencing issues related to mental health are things that are probably expected. If you're Filipino American and you weren't taught that being Filipino American is awesome, you didn't learn about your history, you weren't taught to love yourself, you weren't taught to love your skin color or your flat nose or your slanted eyes, how would you even know that you're beautiful? If you didn't get taught from an early age that to be different is something to be celebrated, that it's okay to be queer or trans, it's okay to be gender nonconforming, it's okay to be a woman or a girl, it's okay to have different interests, of course you'll develop mental health issues. If your parents and other people in your life never asked you directly about how are you feeling, didn't provide you with strategies to cope with things, didn't help you articulate the types of problems you were having, then why wouldn't you have mental health issues? And so this is what I like to acknowledge is that this isn't just my story. I know it's not. And I know that many people in this room have struggled with mental health issues. And for us to realize that this isn't an individual problem, it's a community problem. That is something that we need to fix collectively. That until we can come to a place where children are taught to love themselves from such an early age, that we're expecting our adults to develop problems with self-esteem, mental health issues, and so forth. We also realize that there's the correlation between mental health issues and physical health issues. That when you have mental health issues, it will have a toll on your physical health. And when you have physical health issues, it may take a toll on your mental health. And so for us to acknowledge not just that there are mental health issues that exist, but for us to understand the holistic view and how the intersectionalities of all these different issues takes a toll on your ability to thrive. Next slide, please. I'd like to recognize historical trauma. This is a new direction that I'm going with in our research on Filipino American mental health issues, is this acknowledgement that historical trauma is negatively impacting our mental health. That it's not just that you yourself have suffered many of these different experiences that may have taken a toll on your ability to thrive, but that it goes way back, that it goes deeper. There are studies that find that trauma is transmitted across generations. That if you have histories in your families of things like slavery or genocide or the Holocaust or any number of things, that you will have different levels of stress that you will have that have been transmitted across generations. And so for us to acknowledge the traumas that we have as a Filipino American people, the trauma of colonialism, that colonialism was not pretty. Colonialism wasn't that Spain came and then we became Catholic and everything was fine. That's not colonialism. Colonialism was violence. Colonialism was people forced to change their names, people forced into a religion that wasn't what they believed in. People who were forced to hate what they looked like. People who were forced to adopt cultural values and religious values that weren't part of who they were. And so for us to even acknowledge that a very salient part of being Filipino, which is Catholicism, or for many Filipinos is Catholicism, that's a direct product of colonialism. So I'm not saying for people to turn your back on being Catholic, but to acknowledge that that is a direct product of colonialism. And so what impact does that have on your mental health, knowing that someone back then, generations ago, was forced violently into this religion? I think about things like war. Our families have seen so many different wars in the Philippines, especially, many of them fighting those wars, many of those who were civilians. I tell my story personally about my parents who were children of World War II, where they never talked about what World War II was like for them when I was growing up. And it took later, as my adult life, asking them specific questions, where they talked about seeing people get killed in front of their eyes when they were children. So what impact does that have on the rest of their lives, that they experience this trauma that was never really dealt with, and then it just gets transmitted across different generations? I think about people like the World War II veterans who experienced war, and not only did they not get, did they experience war, which might have led to PTSD syndrome, but now they're also not getting recognized with their benefits for several decades, and then they didn't get their Congressional Gold Medals until more recently. And so what impact of trauma did that have? And then to think about the sexual violence that our people, especially our women, have experienced throughout the years, the homophobia, the transphobia that our people have experienced over the years that have been transcended across generations. To understand that the Philippines was once a matriarchal country, and now it's become slowly a patriarchal country, and how that has an impact on our historical trauma. Some of my research studies recent research studies have found that Filipino Americans have higher levels of historical trauma than other groups, and that there's a relationship between experiences with discrimination and microaggressions with trauma. So finding that people who experience more microaggressions will actually report more trauma symptoms. And so I think part of that is to recognize that there is a relationship between your personal experiences with discrimination and trauma, but also to recognize that perhaps it's beyond you. Maybe these experiences of trauma or these experiences of microaggressions are actually triggers to previous traumas that you may have experienced, or even triggers of historical trauma. And so there needs to be more research that looks at issues related to this. But my last thing that I'm going to talk about is this, or actually, keep on going, I think I missed it. Is just how to become a psychologist activist, a scholar activist, a community leader activist, and to recognize that there are so many different ways that this might look like. To understand that it might be being an activist in the therapy room, it might be being an activist in the classroom, it might be being an activist in a community mental health center, that there are so many ways for this to look like. It also means that being on the street and protesting and rallying when necessary, when advocating for our equities. And to know there's just not one way to do so. To also know that we have to balance it all. Like, we can't possibly be protesting on the street every day and then going to work and expected to do all these different things. That we might have to pick our battles at times, and we might need to find balance of what feels most effective and most feasible for us at the moment. So to recognize there's lots of ways to be activists. But here are some examples of everyday things that I think we all can do to become activists to advocate for Filipino American mental health. One is to think about the systemic issues, the organizational and institutional ways that we can advocate for mental health. So one is, I'm a big fan of supporting ethnic studies, gender studies, queer studies. There are studies that find that students who have ethnic studies will have greater resilience and greater mental health. And just think about what that means in an everyday language. That if you learn about your history and your culture and the effectiveness of your people, that will give you greater self-esteem, which then means that you might be able to thrive in a way that others who don't have that history. To similarly to think about that for people with intersectional identity, so queer studies, gender studies, to know that there's a history of people who've come before you who've been resilient and how that might impact your ability to thrive. I like to think about social justice and trainings of social justice. This needs to go beyond the one-day model where we learn about social justice one day or we talk about multicultural issues one day. It needs to be integrated into every aspect of our lives. For Filipino American community organizations specifically, it means to be intentional in your leadership in talking about multicultural issues, for it not just to be the one conversation you have once a year, but for it to be something that you think about all the time. It could be a leader just thinking of something like, okay, I wonder about how people are feeling included today. I wonder what the gender dynamic of the room is today. I wonder about what this, are there any immigration status dynamics that are affecting our group today, and being able to have those conversations so that it's normalized, and so that you're actively trying to be inclusive and to uplift everyone in your community. With that comes addressing microaggressions when they occur. It means acknowledging that we all can commit microaggressions, and it's very human to commit microaggressions. But is it something that we can talk about? And the more we talk about these sorts of microaggressions, perhaps that can help us to address them when they actually occur. Next slide. With outside of organizations, on individual, interpersonal levels, I think we could do things like starting early. This is a book called Ouch Moments. It's about microaggressions that children might experience. So teaching our kids from a very early age about the types of experiences that they might face so that they can be prepared when microaggressions occur.
Starting early might be even something like giving your children Filipino American children's books. There's a new book coming out called Journey for Justice, the story of Larry Itliong. What if kids learn about the contributions of Filipino Americans from a very young age? Could that build that pride, that ethnic resilience, ethnic identity development that they need to get them through certain parts of their lives? Be part of the communities you study and serve. So being Filipino American is very unique, in my perspective, from other groups. A lot of my colleagues who are of different racial ethnic groups, they don't necessarily have to be part of their communities. So for example, I have a lot of other colleagues of different racial ethnic groups who are very strong in their ethnic and racial identity, very proud of who they are, social justice oriented, but they're not necessarily as involved in their actual community organizations. And this is something that Filipino Americans, what we need to do. If we want our communities to hear what we have to say, we can't just be these professors or these clinicians that write about them and never see the community themselves. We have to be part of those communities. We have to go beyond just talking to our students because our students are privileged. They have access to that. What about the community organizations? For me, it means having the balance of doing things for community organizations for free sometimes, even though you can get paid a lot more somewhere else, because that's what is important in uplifting our community and having the balance of doing that. And so to recognize when you do research studies that you can't just go into a place and say, I want to study you all, that they might not trust you. And so maybe you need to be part of the community for a significant amount of time before you even ask them to be part of your studies. And so to think about the ways that you can better be involved in your communities. Next slide, please. Share your work and make it accessible. It's important for people in academia to publish, and a lot of times we publish or perish, and it's important for people to do things within their own workplaces and do trainings in their workplaces. But how else can we make our work accessible? Can we write op-ed pieces that other people would have access to? In my group earlier, I was talking about how impressed I am with the number of Filipino Americans who are sharing their struggles with mental health issues through the digital world. And that is something that's so validating that it might just be something that you write about and not think that it actually has an impact on the world, but there is somebody out there who's reading that and that they feel seen and heard in a way that they might not have felt by anything else that someone else wrote. Because you're not just acknowledging issues related to mental health, but you're acknowledging your lens of being Filipino American. So to write for people where they can hear those different stories, to tell your stories, to talk about your issues, your mental health issues and struggles in community settings is something. Make your work accessible, or as Dr. David says, give it away. So it's not just something that you are holding yourself or sharing with just a select number of people, but it becomes something that you can share with larger amounts of people. Next slide, please. Practice self-care. Self-care is something that's really important when we talk about mental health issues, because you yourself can't just be the activist that tells people about mental health issues or advocates for mental health issues if you're not taking care of yourself. You're not going to be as effective as you possibly can be if you yourself are not taking care of yourself. And so some people practice yoga, I don't. But if it's yoga, then it's yoga. If it's taking a walk or running, then it's that. If it's going to the gym, it's that. If it's scheduling time in your day to hang out with people that you love and care about, it's that. But what are you doing to take care of yourself? From a more holistic sense or lens, to even think about how your health affects your mental health. So are you exercising? Are you eating well? Are you getting enough sleep? That if you're not doing that, how can you expect other people to learn or model from that? And my last slide, I believe, is to build your own table. So I'm going to tell you the story about Dr. David and I and how Filipino American psychology as a field came to be. So I told you about how we started to write books and how we started to publish articles. And part of it was just really like kismet at that moment, because Dr. David was studying at the University of Illinois. I initially was at Michigan, so I don't know what Filipinos are doing over there, but we were there. I later later went to New York and I was at Columbia. And so we found each other somehow. This was like before social media really existed. We started communicating. We found that we were really interested in this sort of work. Without even really knowing each other, to be honest, like just knowing that he did great work and just feeling comfortable. I think this is where that comfort comes in. Like I didn't even know him, but I was like already like telling him everything about myself we just felt that connectedness. So when we went through graduate school, we were publishing. We had mentors who were not Filipino, but who encouraged us, and we were publishing. We wrote our books, and then we were like, we really need to have a space where Filipino Americans can come together. And so with that, we got together with a couple of other psychologists within the Asian American Psychological Association, and we formed what is called the Division on Filipino Americans under the Asian American Psychological Association. And that was 10 years ago, or 9 years ago, 2009, I think is when we became official. The DOFA under the Asian American Psychological Association was created because when we used to go to the AAPA, you could literally count the number of Filipinos in the room. There'd be hundreds of people there, and there'd be 3 Filipinos. So why is it that Filipinos make up 1/5 of the Asian American population, yet out of DOFA, they made up 0.3% of the population, or whatever? I don't know how to do math. That's I'm just kidding. Filipinos can do math. But that became something important. So we said, like, well, let's form this. We contacted the few Filipinos that we know that were in mental health or in psychology, and this again was like, the start of social media. And so we formed this thing. We had a petition. We had enough people sign it, and the Division on Filipino Americans was formed. The year after that, we had some meetings, and so we started to see within the Asian American Psych Association, we started to see the number of people who were part of DOFA grow. So we started to see that there were like 10 members, like 20 members that would come to these little meetings we had. In 2015, the leadership, so EJ and I were the chairs initially, and then the leadership transitioned to Dr. Alicia Del Prado and Dr. Rochelle Concepcion. And as I said, we encouraged them to have a conference. We had a conference, our first conference in San Francisco, which was put together in just a couple of months. We had almost 100 participants who showed up. And then 2 years later, so 2017, right? Yes, Christine Catapone is now the co-chair of DOFA. We had a conference and there were like 300 people that were there. So there still are not as many Filipino American psychologists, but there are a lot of Filipino American mental health practitioners, whether it be social workers, counselors, or even students who are aspiring for that. And so we founded this organization that's now almost 10 years old, and now we have all these people that are advocating for Filipino American mental health. And so I say this to you all because I applaud all of you all for being here today. I applaud the organizers for being here, and this is what it takes. Sometimes when you're not invited to the table, you have to build your own freaking table. And sometimes when you build that table, people will come. And if we have more Filipino Americans who are committed to mental health issues, if we have more Filipino Americans who are psychologists and social workers and counselor educators, and people beyond medicine and nursing who are advocating for mental health, that perhaps this becomes now a viable career choice for other Filipino Americans to go into. I love Filipino doctors, I love Filipino nurses, and perhaps a lot of the reason why we continue to have more people in those fields is because that's what people are familiar with. But maybe if we see Filipinos as psychologists or as professors or as any of these number of things, that can help us to increase the numbers that we need. We oftentimes see what we see, and what some of my colleagues will say, especially Dr. Sylvia Missoula would say, is you can't be what you can't see. And that's something that really I hope resonates with you all. And it's not just even with your career choice, but if we're not talking about mental health issues, then younger people, next generation, they're not going to know that it's okay to talk about mental health issues. And so really, we all have to be those change agents. And so I end by saying to you all that I hope that you all realize the impact that you have on other people, that you all realize that even one conversation you have with somebody on mental health is an effective conversation. That one conference you create on mental health is something that can be even bigger and trickle down to even more people, but that we all actively need to work together. That it's not just one person, it's not just 5 people that are going to do this, it's something that we all need to collectively do together. And I say thank you all to the coordinators for having us, and Maraming Salamat, and happy Filipino American History Month. Thank you.
There you go. So I started without a microphone, and I feel like I have a voice now. So this wraps up our program. I just wanted to say on behalf of the Filipino American Foundation for Charities, thank you all for attending this forum. I would say just a little story about myself. We did a webinar about 4 years ago. I was an intern at Fiesta, and it was highlighting the Filipino American History Month. And the reason why it came about was really through conversations I had with my former supervisor, Rosalind. And she said, you know, why don't you put it together? Why don't you figure out who's out there in the field really doing this work? And through that conversation, led to many connections, talking to Dr. Nadal and Dr. David. And I think this right here is a testament of how this conversation is continuing. And I didn't really have any words to say beyond thank you, and that PAFC is doing this work for our community here in the DC metropolitan area. We have a program that is strengthening intergenerational, intercultural ties in immigrant families, a parenting program that we are going to implement in January, and hope that anybody in this room that has families interested in this parent and this family program will join. We have flyers over here. For those that are facilitating, can you raise your hands? So we have Christian, Jonathan, Maylene, they're all volunteers doing this good work. And we hope that you all, if you have any questions about doing a similar program in your various areas, would be happily to us as well. In addition to that, I wanted to also just thank those that are in this room that have built tables in various arenas. The people that are invited here today we're invited here through the connections that I knew. So, for example, NAFA, National Federation of Filipino American Associations, Susan Tango was a part of the Japanese White House Initiative on Asian American Pacific Islanders. They did an empowerment ambassador program for youth. And I feel like when we talk about mentorship, it is so important to continue to empower our young leaders. And they do a similar program with EPIC, which is empowering Filipinos through youth collaboration. EPIC, yes, Christian and Austin are here today. And so we're seeing that mentorship and just doing these opportunities to amplify our voices is changing the way our community really thinks about ourselves and is empowering our future leaders of tomorrow. And so I started off by saying that leaders, to take the stance of a leader, and that leaders aren't the ones that know everything, they're the ones that know how to collect the collective intelligence. I'd like to leave you all with saying that leaders lead from any chair. With your informal authority, your formal authority, you have the power to make a difference. And leaders live in the future. Build your own table. You do not have to exist and live in tables that you're currently sitting in. You can create more things for our community because you have the power to do that. And so thank you all for attending this. This is the first of many conversations. Like I mentioned, PSC is going to continue this through various programs, and we hope to connect you all with the Healthy Mind Initiative that has a ton of programs on youth empowerment. We have people across the room that have just a ton of expertise. Look at the bios. And I just hope that this is just the starting point for you all to process this and have those collaborations. And so we're going to send these slides out in addition to the reporting that was here done today. And we wanted to just end this with just saying that, you know, there's food that we have for you all for waiting, and it is a Filipino lunch. I know I wrote at Marianne earlier, but after talking to my parents, it is actually a lunch of many, many, many different cuisines. And so I would actually want to just thank my parents for doing that for us. I really mentioned families earlier, and that there's sometimes a generational divides in how we communicate. But I would just want to say to my parents that I know that giving is their way of showing me their love, and being able to share in food and doing that for me means a lot to me. And I also would like to just give a shout out to my aunt. She immigrated here yesterday from the Philippines. And we're so happy. It's just a testament of showing that family is very important to our communities, and it's very comfortable. Thank you. I just wanted to say. Very happy to have you all here, but also very happy that my family is here to continue to share this with me, and just wish you all the best. We are going to have food in the hall to our left, and then we are going to, for those that are attending the walk, we'll have all of those attendees attend the walk at the Lincoln Memorial starting at 3. Ryan, do you have anything else to note? Okay. All right, thank you everyone. Again, food, the t-shirts that we told in the email are there. Feel free to